tēnā koutou katoa, ka nui te mihi, ka nui te aroha, tēnā koutou katoa, ko ai au, he uri ahau o Ngāpuhi me te raroa, no mangawhai ahau, no motukaraka me Pākānai ahau. So I'm Jade, I'm from Hokianga, from up north, and I am from some small places called Motukaraka and Pākānai, and I currently live in Mangawhai, but I'm working at the University of Auckland. Apologies, it's a little bit late for me.
So over to you, Jade.
Awesome. So hey, look, thanks so much, Tracy, for inviting me to be part of this collective and this wonderful kind of international conversation about sexual and reproductive justice. So my contribution comes from Aotearoa and comes from an Indigenous place, and in terms of thinking about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous notions of justice in the context of sexual violence prevention. And the ability of our communities to really respond to sexual violence and be resourced to actually deliver services and interventions to those impacted by it. So I probably didn't mention before, but I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland and also Associate Dean Māori in the Faculty of Science. So part of what I'm really interested in is thinking about the role and the place of Māori knowledge systems and the ways in which this has been marginalised and at times denied by Eurocentric or Western knowledge systems. We know that colonisation has impacted Indigenous peoples in a range of different ways and with very, very negative impacts. So we know that colonisation disrupted Māori self-determination, Māori systems of law, Māori systems of governance, and ways of resolving conflicts and issues that happened within our communities. We know that through colonisation, there was a sort of erosion of our cultural values, our cultural ways of being, including that of whanaungatanga, or our kind of collective ways of living that provided checks and balances and safeguards for people from things like violence or abuse in the context of relationships that was often dealt with by a whānau collective who would hold someone who's enacted harm on another, hold them to account and find a way of actually kind of restoring that balance between the people and elevating the mana or the prestige of the person who had been harmed so that they could be supported into a place of healing. We also know that colonisation has disrupted our understandings of gender, our notions of the mana that's inherent in being a woman or wahine, or the mana that's inherent in being tāne or man, and also the mana that's inherent in being takatāpui or gender fluid and not sort of positioned within the gender binary. So the imposition of Western constructs and understandings of genders has certainly created a particular kind of vulnerability for Māori in the current sociocultural contexts. Yeah, we also know that in the kind of devaluing of Māori ways of knowing and being, or mātauranga Māori, our systems of knowledge, our systems of healing have also been not only not acknowledged, but not even available or accessible often for our people who try to seek support in the aftermath of sexual violence. So this knowledge has existed, for a very, very long time and has persisted. And, we're really lucky that there are still keepers of this knowledge in our communities today, and that there is a kind of strong growth and burgeoning of Māori approaches to understanding well-being, to understanding healing, that is starting to kind of come through in university contexts. But when it comes to a community environment, these often aren't the modalities that are represented, that are taught to practitioners. We see inequities in who gets to kind of be considered a practitioner, who is properly remunerated for it, and who is given the kind of the decision-making power, really, in terms of how support might be offered and in what ways. So the particular chapter that I contributed to this wonderful, wonderful book is sort of based on some work I was doing with the project, a Health Research Council funded project called Becoming Sexual Beings. And the focus was really to look at and explore the sociocultural context of young people's sexual lives, to understand where there were challenges, where there were opportunities, where things were working well, and actually understand how young people were managing their relational and sexual lives in the context of new digital technologies. As part of this project, I interviewed 23 stakeholders about their mātauranga associated with sexual violence prevention, intervention, healing. And alongside one of my master's students, Fern Smith, we interviewed 30 rangatahi or young Māori about their lives, about their experiences. And I've been really well supported by my wonderful colleagues, Linda Waimare Nikora, Nicola Gavey, and one of my aunties, Cheryl Turner, who allowed the project to actually be situated within our rohi in the Hokianga in a small place called Pakanai. So what that meant was that the knowledge that I've been learning and gaining is knowledge from the people who are part of my whānau, part of my hapu, part of my iwi. So it's been really special to actually be learning about the kinds of knowledges and practices and how things used to be, as well as how people are sort of working new ways of doing things in our current contemporary life and in the context of colonisation. So in speaking to key stakeholders and kaumata or elders in this project, my main aim was really to document mātauranga that might be helpful in preventing sexual violence and to sort of be thinking about ways to share that with young people. And instead, I actually pivoted in many respects because what became very clear was that the people who were working on the ground supporting people who'd experienced sexual violence were actually facing marginalisation, stigmatisation themselves. We're often quite neglected by government services and agencies, chronically underfunded. And so it seemed to be the right thing to do, actually, to kind of share their stories, to actually advocate for better resourcing and better recognition for the work that they do. So where I'm from in the Hokianga, it's a very remote, very socioeconomically deprived area. I think one of my aunties who's done some research on this has noted that I think that one of the censuses, which the data collection often isn't very accurate, but I think the estimated income was around something like 20,000 a year. So that gives you a bit of an understanding of the kinds of the level of deprivation that people in the area live with, and unfortunately that's extended through those who work in social services as well in many respects. So this particular chapter was a bit of a mihi, or a bit of an acknowledgement to those who work in the front lines with our people. So I did a pūrākau analysis, and that's a kind of a Māori approach to storytelling, or thinking about what it would mean to tell a story from a community. That is a kind of a more fulsome kind of account and picture about what it means to be working in sexual violence prevention for Māori, by Māori, and for Māori in this area. So I kind of looked at three main themes across the participant accounts, and the first thing kind of spoke to the ways in which Māori community, the Māori community's agency, their ability to be self-determining in responding to sexual violence was hugely curtailed, was hugely hampered and hindered by this chronic lack of resourcing. In the area, there were very few Māori who were qualified as psychologists, and I guess that where that is relevant is that psychologists often have the power to write reports that inform treatment plans and decision makings, and when people are writing from a different cultural context, they're not always able to pick up on the nuances that are important to somebody who is Māori to even be able to understand or speak to therapeutic modalities that are anchored in mātauranga Māori and in our systems of knowledge. And to be able to speak to what healing can be like for people who are sort of moving through a space of colonisation. We also know that for the few Māori psychologists working in this area, burnout was a huge problem. And so that kind of meant that there was, just sort of stretched the resources even further. And thinking about the sort of constraints and limits on Māori agency in responding to sexual violence, we know that a lot of national conversations about sexual violence, perhaps less so now with Marama Davidson, who is Māori in a really significant ministerial role as the Minister for Family and Sexual Violence. She's sort of changed things quite a lot, but at the time I was doing this research, it was very rare to hear about sexual violence prevention from Māori perspectives. That the kind of dominant kind of narratives were sort of based on Western assumptions and knowledge about the idea of, people moving through a justice system, people going to prison, that didn't really kind of even hold a space for thinking about hauhorongo, or the notion of peacemaking, especially when in a sort of sexual harm had occurred within a whānau context, where there might be a need to think about how to restore the whānau and everybody who's been impacted by sexual violence. And similarly, that the notion of rehabilitation often is something that's not considered either. And the second theme, I think, as I've sort of spoken to a little bit, Māori experts and innovators. So Māori ingenuity in actually developing treatment modalities that have been harnessing mātauranga Māori, and also thinking about, new ways of bringing that into a contemporary context. That often Māori who are at the forefront of this are not seen. It's often only those who've got the Western qualifications who are given any kind of recognition as having some kind of knowledge or expertise in this area. Often overseas expertise was privileged, so people who'd come from a program that they'd learnt from overseas was often seen as seen as better than those who had sort of more homegrown approaches. And the kind of local insights that can be gained from living in a community for many, many years and understanding the kinds of social issues that are layered upon an experience of, sexual violence trauma, that kind of local insight and connection was often undervalued in the assumption that, someone could just kind of helicopter in from somewhere else and fix all the problems, which seemed to be something that's happened time and time again, at the expense of actually growing the workforce from within the community itself. And then the third and last theme was really, I was quite struck by a lot of these Māori innovators who have been developing these wonderful services and programs for people, and the ways in which sometimes their ideas were deliberately taken by government agencies and then actually extracted from there and actually taken to towns and cities so that their funding was dried up, and then they gifted that whole idea to somebody else, so that our community in Hokianga was left high and dry effectively, while other communities that had a higher population were given the very kind of resources, funds and structure of the programs that had been developed in the Hokianga for the Hokianga to meet the kind of specific demands in that context. And similarly, there were also stories of people who'd worked with government agencies who thought, wow, this is a great idea, this is a great program, we're going to just take it and we're going to make it better, we're going to improve it. And what they did was whitewash it, took out the kind of the aspects of it that connected it to Māori culture and sort of appropriated it effectively, stealing it, and not actually giving recognition to the very people who developed and designed it. So we often see this pattern with Māori innovators who are kind of assumed to be the recipients of that kind of knowledge that, for instance, government or indeed sometimes researchers have kind of worked with, written about, shaped, and then kind of delivered with their name attached to it or their department attached to it. So, I think there's a lot of learnings to be gained here, and thinking about how, especially for us as academics, how might we be inadvertently perpetuating a kind of colonial process that we might not be stealing people's land, but we're certainly stealing their ideas, certainly stealing their intellectual property. So, one of the approaches I developed in this particular project was to make sure that I attributed people's material to their name and made sure I got sign off from them that they were happy for that to appear in their report. So, yeah, in summary, I think, sexual and reproductive justice for Māori, Indigenous people of Aotearoa New Zealand, is multi-layered and intrinsically connected to colonisation, and not only historical colonisation that has led to many of the sort of health and social inequities that we see today, but also the kind of an ongoing process that we need to be very vigilant and aware of how we might be inadvertently perpetuating that in our practice. So ka nui te mihi, ka nui te aroha, tēnā koutou katoa. Should I pass on to you, Kate, to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Kia ora tātou. I'm Kate. I'm a PhD candidate at the Kirby Institute, University of New South Wales. but from Ngāmotu originally, New Plymouth. So yeah, great to be here. And kia ora, Jay, that was fascinating and just, yeah, wonderful to listen to you speak. Thank you so much for that. And I guess we're going to take a little bit of a turn now into looking at some of these like introduced hegemonic kind of criminal justice systems and how they're used and how they, in particular, looking at, oh, have I got the display right? I don't think so. And yeah, in particular, looking at cases of infanticide in the Pacific, and particularly looking at how women are constructed in criminal trials. So as I mentioned, my name is Kate, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of New South Wales at the Kirby Institute. Alrighty, so this is kind of what I'm going to cover off today, and I'm going to have to be really brief about the kind of background information, because when I was timing myself, I went on a much too long ramble about all of that stuff, and then I'll go through the kind of key themes that we found in these cases. So just to start with, I'm just going to touch on this sort of very complex and extensive history of all these different forces that have kind of shaped this sort of maternal ideal. And they are complex and where these spanned, you know, a couple of 100 years kind of thing. But what I really want to hone in on here is the extensive engagement of missionaries in particular in different Pacific Island communities. And over sort of, particularly from around the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. So missionary approaches were, of course, really varied, as were how these teachings were interacted with and resisted and adopted in different communities, as you would expect. But just to kind of focus in on the fact that there were very particular, I guess, interventions or instruction of particularly related to maternal and gendered behaviour. So particularly relating to sort of these, I guess, Protestant middle-class ideals of the domesticated wife and mother. And so that's what I really want to think about here, is the ways in which these ideals, which definitely do come out in the criminal court cases that I'm going to be discussing, how these ideals were very much constructed, you know, bringing in different kind of interventions from colonial administrations, interactions with missionaries, noting as well that these are also varied in terms of how they were adapted, and also in terms of how they often added to women's workloads as well. So also just to kind of provide a little bit of background. So on the kind of legal side of things, so most Pacific Island states and territories are common law jurisdictions derived from colonial legislation and jurisprudence, and with a continued reliance on case law from these countries, including New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand and Australia. And the law pertaining to the offence / defence of infanticide is a legacy, largely a legacy of British colonisation in the Pacific, with laws pertaining to infanticide, related to infanticide, which all countries in this study had except for Vanuatu. So that these laws more or less replicate the British Infanticide Act, which was amended in 1938. So what is this offence? So the infanticide is both a distinct homicide offence and a partial defence for murder in cases where a woman causes the death of her biological infant, usually under 12 months of age, by any willful act or omission, and where at the time of the act or omission the balance of her mind was disturbed due to her not having fully recovered from the effect of birth or due to the effect of lactation. So the kind of take-home message in this law is the relationship, and sometimes only temporarily, between the physiological processes of birthing and of lactation and of disturbance of mind, the assumption of a disturbance of mind in that context. The other cases that we looked at and that we analysed were concealment of the birth of a dead infant through secret disposal of its body. Kind of sort of sounds like what it is. But how this relates to infanticide is it relates to those cases where prosecution counsels can't prove that an infant was born alive in order, and then was therefore, passed away due to an act or omission by a disturbed woman who had just given birth or was lactating. So that's kind of the relationship there. So that also we're thinking about, stillbirths where women, for whatever reason, might have tried to hide the fact of its birth or not reported its birth, that kind of thing. So that's just a bit of kind of legal background. So we analysed 63 infanticide or concealment of birth cases, and these were from 1961 until 2019, and they were all sourced from the Pacific Islands Legal Information Institute. We really wanted to understand as much as we could, given we didn't have the full subjective accounts from these women, but what we could understand about the lives and the contextual factors underpinning these women ending up in court. Also we wanted to understand more broadly how women and gender and maternity were constructed in the arguments or the narratives put forward by these courts. So largely I managed to find sentencing, judgment, and summary documents. Those were what I managed to find from these cases. Some of them were fairly long. So just to kind of start off with, these are the kind of key reoccurring socioeconomic factors that were involved in these cases. So this is fairly typical across the other literature that I found in terms of crimes like infanticide that particularly relate to mothering. So young age, no prior convictions aside from 2 women, abandonment, limited financial means, or independence alongside significant, parenting and economic obligations, little or no social and emotional support, isolation. Quite a lot of women were facing or had faced abuse, including sexual abuse, and lack of assistance as solo parents. We're really thinking about huge vulnerability, just to kind of set the scene here. And so there were 3 main findings from our thematic analysis. In terms of how these women in particular were constructed. And the first major one was this failure to conform to medical standards in pregnancy and in birth. So all of these women attempted to hide their pregnancies, and also we're thinking about the context of isolation and all of these factors. None of the women were able to receive or received any kind of antenatal care or any care during their pregnancy. And all except one experienced unattended births, so they birthed alone. And also, I just want to note here that sometimes this also meant that the actual circumstances surrounding the birth were pretty uncertain. So, for example, women gave birth alone standing up, and the infant fell on its head, and that was sort of the cause of death. But women still ended up in court and sometimes facing prison sentences in this context. And so importantly, these factors were constructed by courts, usually in one of 2 ways, usually either as evidence of their disturbed state of mind and therefore supporting an infanticide conviction, or the fact that these women, concealed their pregnancies, didn't access any healthcare or attended access birth attendants, was sometimes used as evidence of criminal intent. So the fact that they didn't receive any care was related to the fact that they had these kind of evil intentions to later kill their infant. So of course, nothing here really around like why were women having to conceal what was the fear there, what was going on for them. Why couldn't they, were they unable to receive antenatal care? Why were they giving births alone? None of these were really addressed in any kind of substantial or insubstantial way. So the next major theme was this corruption of the kind of maternal ideal. And this is relates back to this construct of the kind of middle-class ideals of that good Christian wife and mother, essentially. And what's important again here is that these ideals were treated by courts very much as innate, normal and as measurements for normal. So so women were seen as violating these norms, and these ideals were very much engaged as a measure for worthiness and for normalcy. So the circumstances of the actual circumstances, what these women were going through, isolation, abuse, fear, poverty, they were really hardly engaged with. They weren't used as the measurement for, if you like, these ideals were used as the measurement. Also, in some cases, and kind of also drawing on these ideals, the woman's sort of unborn child and current dependents were sometimes referenced as lessening or influencing the terms of their sentence, and specifically in order that she might not, doesn't fail any further in her maternal duties. So the maternal ideal, although clearly, as I've discussed earlier, it's socially constructed, it was treated as innate, intuitive, and a measurement for normal. So the final theme that I want to touch on that we found, and this kind of relates to the one that I just discussed, was this idea of the women as good mothers who acted out of character when they sort of committed their crimes, if you like. So in these kind of constructions, evidence of women's successful performance as mothers with other dependents, and sometimes drawing on other sort of successful performance of these particular ideals, played a significant role in sort of garnering sympathy in the narratives, particularly of defence counsels. It was also an important mitigating factor. And also there was this theme of, or within this theme, a theme within the theme of the defendant's actual or anticipated realisation of her involvement, however tenuous, in her baby's death or in the concealment of it. And her sort of, I guess, corruption as a maternal figure in this sense. This was sometimes constructed by courts as being sufficient punishment. So, of course, all of this, and as well as this sort of good mother who acted out of character, this depoliticizes and decontextualizes women's responses to significant injustice and abuse that were faced by these women, and does nothing to address these factors. So in this final theme, for example, presents the kind of incident as an anomaly in an otherwise socially acceptable life of good domestic and maternal behaviours, which are natural and normal, not socially constructed according to the courts, and sometimes ought to continue unhindered. So this is, of course, despite the fact that these pregnancies occurred in systems of oppression, isolation, sexual and physical abuse, socioeconomic and gendered inequity. I'm just keeping an eye on the time because I don't want to go on for too long, but just to sort of summarise. So while the infanticide law requires a link, at least temporarily, between the offence, the defendant's reproductive functions and mental disturbance, of course, these cases reveal a much more nuanced picture of power inequality and how they constrain women's choices, but also their ability to parent safely and sustainably, and to live lives free from violence, and all of these kind of factors. So put simply, in these cases, either the woman's reproductive bodies rendered them mentally incapable or irrational, or they acted on free choice, meaning that they were criminally culpable. And this kind of leaves no room for analysing all the ways in which all of these factors that I've mentioned really constrain women's agency. So maternity was constructed by the courts in complex ways to transcend history, consciousness, and the daily struggles of these women. And these women who were, tried and convicted, as I mentioned, they faced multiple injustices. So many were socially isolated, economically vulnerable, had survived abuse, were treated with suspicion and contempt, and they were also denied access to the resources and power to render their situation any differently. So that's kind of a summary of the analysis that's in chapter 12 of this book. hopefully that wasn't too sort of rambly. I felt like I was trying to fit a lot in there, but that's my email address if anyone wants to get in touch to talk further about this analysis. And of course there'll be question time, but thank you very much, everyone.
As well. So I want to start with the voices of our participants, who were women from South Africa and Aotearoa, talking about contraceptive decision-making. Yara. It was really a lot of doctor, nurse-led, this is what we think is going to be best for you. You should give this a go. If I had said to my doctor then, no, I don't want to be on the jab, they would have been like, well, we don't think that's the best option for you. And when a doctor says, we don't think that's a good option, you just nod and agree. Sandra. I think I didn't have a choice in the end because I was Maori and young and out of school. Like, I'm just going to be another unplanned teenage pregnancy. Ushle. Obviously, when you're being discharged from the hospital, they do inject you. In fact, they don't tell you and don't beg you, especially if you are a child and you have a child. They don't beg you. They don't ask you if you want it or not. So these excerpts are all from our transnational study. The data was collected in South Africa by Yanela Ndabula and supervised by Katrina McLeod, and I collected the data in Aotearoa. And we interviewed women about their experiences of contraceptive consultations and counselling, and specifically focusing on their decision-making around LARCs. So we used a reproductive justice approach alongside post-structural feminist theory to highlight how contraceptive agency is enabled or restricted by the power relations that surround the contraceptive counselling space. So obviously you can read a little bit more about the methodology in the chapter, and I've recently written a little bit about how to apply reproductive justice as a lens. And one of the approaches that I've spoken about is the approach that we use in this chapter, which is to use post-structural feminist theory to sort of operationalize reproductive justice lens. What I want to point out now is how these quotes illustrate two ways that contraceptive agency is restricted. So first, by provider-patient power relations, the common positioning of healthcare providers as experts, which accords them more power in decision-making processes. So we saw that in the first quote that I read, where the participant speaks about just nodding and agreeing with the experts. Then the second way that, the second way that contraceptive agency is restricted is by power relations related to age and race. So we saw in those second two quotes by Gushle and Sandra that because they're young women, they don't have a say in the contraception that they are offered or just given without being asked. So within the dominant sexual and reproductive health and rights paradigm, family planning initiatives across the world prioritize voluntary rights-based approaches to contraceptive care. But the quotes that I read suggest that this isn't always the case. This isn't always the experience that people have when they seek contraceptive advice. And our findings point to constraints on contraceptive agency, even in the face of unanimous endorsement of rights-based voluntary care in policy and by providers themselves. So despite overt support of a patient's right to choose, the healthcare interactions that our participants described, which I've given you a bit of a taste of, often swayed to the side of coercion in more or less subtle ways. And as the quotes indicate, these were shaped by politics related to race, class, and age. And these underlie the determinations about that providers make about who should or shouldn't be having children, when they should be having children, what the spacing should be. And it's possible to see that LARC in particular, and obviously contraception more broadly, can act as a source of oppression for women who are deemed undesirable or socially undesirable reproducers, like the young Maori teenage woman, like the child having a child. And what was really interesting is when I started to analyze the data in Aotearoa and looked at the healthcare providers' accounts, there were these echoes in the data. And I was really surprised by that, because obviously the healthcare providers who took part all expressed broad support for women-centered care, and obviously supported reproductive choice. And probably that's why they decided to take part in the study. But at the same time, they also described counseling approaches that are not consistent with these ideals and actually really corroborate what the women were saying to us. So they described, let me just give you some quotes before. So this is a quote from a nurse in Aotearoa, called Kaya, and she said, so selling or trying to sell more of the pros about it than the cons, you know, so she's talking about LARC specifically. I'm always trying to be real open and honest, but, you know, try and push more of a long-term contraception. So what her quote illustrates is how providers spoke about what their main job was as a contraceptive provider, and that was to prevent unplanned pregnancy, and that meant that they needed to get their patients to use high efficacy contraception. And like Kaya, they often spoke about selling or pushing patients to use LARC, especially if they were what they called at-risk patients, so young, Indigenous and poor women. And participants justified these practices as acting in women's best interests. So promoting responsible choices, protecting or empowering vulnerable or at-risk women. And I mean, I have to recognize that most likely they did want to make sure that their patients had the best care possible. They were interested in doing what was in their patient's best interest. But this kind of protectionism, or this, I suppose, cloak of benevolence in a way, kind of obscures and reinforces these ideals that underpin their judgments, these Western middle-class ideals that really actually condemn the childbearing of Indigenous and poor women, and enables providers to effectively monitor their practices. So, yeah, so I mean, that's obviously we didn't present on the provider data. We were looking at the patient data only. But it is interesting, I think, and what I wanted to just highlight there is that there seems to be this resonance across the two data sets. So what I want to do in the rest of this talk is just speak a little bit about what this means to have kind of researched this issue in this particular way. So what is the value, I guess, of using a reproductive justice lens for this study? So I guess to highlight that, I want to contrast the way we did our research with more kind of traditional rights-oriented research that is often the type of research that we see around contraceptive care. So researchers have focused on individual level aspects of contraceptive decision-making and care, usually kind of what's going on in people's heads, to try to assess the kind of ability that women have to choose contraception, and ultimately what they're trying to do is find ways to empower and strengthen individual autonomy, to enable women to make good use of contraception. The other tack that's been taken in the research is to identify access or uptake barriers. So what are the things that are stopping women, usually from choosing LARC, and how do we remove those barriers? So classically, as we know, this would be things like studies that look at knowledge, attitudes, and perceptions of LARC specifically. And As we know, as critical social researchers, the overemphasis in this kind of research is on choice and personal autonomy. And that focus on choice overshadows the ways that decision-making is always contingent, partial, and lived by people within particular socio-political context. People could have other priorities or preferences or desires that aren't necessarily rational. It's that kind of messy real life stuff. And the focus on choice obviously also makes us hold women responsible for pregnancy prevention and controlling their fertility, and to blame if they don't make the choices that we as researchers or providers or policymakers think they should be making. So what's missing really from the kind of mainstream research around contraceptive care that usually takes a sort of rights-based approach is a view of contraceptive counselling and care as a social process that takes place within a wider social context. So that's what the reproductive justice lens remedies. From a reproductive justice perspective, contraceptive counselling and care is a social process that reflects and reinforces social norms and inequities that are related to gender and its intersections with race and class. So it brings that kind of intersectional lens and looks at those crisscrossing relations of power that either enable or constrain people to make decisions about their reproductive lives. So if I had to say, what does our study do that's different to the mainstream research? I would say that it helps to understand the deeper underlying aspects of coercion that are linked to wider social understandings and meanings, or what we would call discourses about, for example, what it means to be a good woman or mother, who should have children, when, and under what conditions, and then how these discourses and ideals come to bear on decision-making processes, how providers offer care and the choices that they make available to patients, and what ultimately patients can choose and act on. So our research shows how these discourses support norms and unequal relationships related to age, ethnicity, race, and so forth. So using a reproductive justice approach helped us to expand the meaning of reproductive control. So it's not just in an interpersonal space. It's not related only to something that's going on in someone's head. It helps us to shed light on complexity of contraceptive decision-making and to show not only the subtle ways that reproductive agency can be restricted, but also for whom. So from those quotes, you can see that we identified age and ethnicity as being quite significant. And based on our findings, we would condemn the targeting that's often supported in policy and in service delivery. So targeting at-risk groups is often how it's articulated. Young people, poor people, people of color. And that happens through counseling strategies, incentives, or other means to try to get them to increase uptake of certain contraceptive methods. So our study extends the critical literature on LARC. It contributes to an under-researched area around agency and coercion in contraceptive care. And we think that our findings have important implications for the delivery of contraceptive care.
Okay, so hi everyone. Apologies for the delay. Okay, so I'm Jabulile Mary Jane Jace Mavuso. I co-edited this book with Tracy, and I'll be speaking to my chapter now, which in the book is the very last one before the conclusion. And that chapter really speaks to safe abortion. Me and my colleagues, Katrina McLeod and Ryan DeToy, were really the premise for our chapter is really to trouble the notion of safe abortion. Normative definitions of safe abortion focus on the skill set of the provider and or where abortions take place, in particular facilities, what the facilities look like, access to equipment, all those kinds of things. And a lot of the work from Latin America, particularly Brazilian feminists, have really started to push this idea of what is a safe abortion, because normative definitions tend to conflate safe abortions with those that are legally provided, legally recognized by a state, and that then therefore take place in some kind of hospital or clinic facility. And Latin American feminists have pushed this to say that definition, or have really shown how that definition is limiting in countries where there is restrictive abortion laws. So where safe abortion wouldn't necessarily happen in a kind of legally recognized setting or legally enabled setting. And so that their efforts have shifted notions of safe abortion to include abortions that aren't being provided by a healthcare worker, where abortion seekers and pregnant people are being assisted to manage it on their own, but they're nonetheless safe because of access to accurate information, instructions on how to carry out their abortion. Even with all of this, our chapter really starts from the premise that these normative definitions and less normative definitions of abortion leave out psychological harm that is either exacerbated or caused by anti-abortion directive counseling. So we then were looking at the kind of abortion that happened in, for example, South Africa, where the research was conducted, where abortion is legal, but where abortion is for many folks inaccessible despite being legal because of various factors, including abortion stigma, anti-abortion attitudes and discourses, but also lots of other factors. But where we have this legal framework, and yet the abortions that take place in hospitals would fit these normative definitions as far as who is conducting the abortion and where the abortion is taking place. But our argument is that these abortions are still unsafe because of the psychological harm of anti-abortion directive counseling. So that's where our chapter is really intervening, to say these normative definitions and bodies like the WHO need to take into account psychological and emotional harm from any kind of directive counseling, but we are focusing on anti-abortion directive counseling. So our research, well, the two studies were conducted in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, in 3 hospitals, 3 facilities, and 1 research study, my colleague Ryan Dutoy's research study, focused exclusively on recording the actual pre-abortion consultation sessions or counseling sessions and analyzing those. And then my research focused on interviewing people who had accessed abortion services at these 3 sites. And they are cisgender women. So interviewing them, but then also interviewing the abortion providers themselves. And so our research then but works together. And in our chapter, we really bring the findings together to give a holistic picture of what happens when certain discourses, and I'll just go into the findings now, of what happens when religious discourses that construct abortion as sinful, against a higher power. In this particular case, was constructed as against God, unchristian-like. When religious discourses and fetal personhood discourses, which construct the fetus or child as the primary person involved in an abortion, and the person who is the most vulnerable, and the person who needs protection in a very particular way. But also womanhood / motherhood discourses, which really configure not only pregnant people as cis women, like categorically, but which also configure women as always already mothers. And all of these discourses working together to engender a very particular relationship that a pregnant person must have with their fetus or child. And that particular relationship is one of protection, is one of mothering. And seeing how all of this happens in an abortion, on a pre-abortion counseling session. So that is, my colleague's set of findings. But then linking that, we were able to show in this chapter how those have very direct consequences on the pregnant person who's coming for an abortion. And so my part of my study really used micro-narratives, narrative discursive approach. And we highlighted 3 micro-narratives. The one was I was ready to say I am counseling. Sorry, I was ready to say I am canceling / I have doubts. That was the one micro-narrative, which really spoke to the doubts and fears that participants had because of the counseling they went through. That they came in relatively certain, some very certain, and then emerged feeling very uncertain, feeling like they were doing something wrong, feeling like they were, what came up strongly in the data is that they were made to feel that they were risking their own lives by having an abortion in a very legal setting, safe setting, just FYI, but that they were risking their lives, but also risking the lives of their fetuses or children. So that was the one micro-narrative. Then the second micro-narrative was I was hurt, where participants were really speaking about their pain, the pain that they felt that was produced or exacerbated by the counseling itself, where they were feeling like they were doing something wrong and feeling very bad and feeling very painful emerging from the counseling session. And then the last micro-narrative was, it was hard, but I don't have a choice, which kind of merged the first 2, where participants had doubt and conflict, decisional conflict and confusion, and some experienced real pain, but neither of those could be resolved in the way that providers were aiming for, because abortion was the only option for these women in particular. So being left with all of these harms and not being able to do anything about these harms, having to go through with the abortion anyway, because it was the only available avenue for them. It's the only thing that made sense. It was the only thing that they could do. And some of them, that's what they wanted to do. This is what they wanted to do. So looking at and putting the data side by side was really helpful for that, is that it really enabled us to look at everything holistically and to go, this is what happens when abortion counseling is anti-abortion and is directive, and how then can we call this kind of abortion care safe? It's really problematic to call this safe. It's really harmful to call this safe. This is not safe abortion. And that's really what we were looking at. And then bringing in a reproductive justice perspective, looking at how all of this harm impacts pregnant people's rights to have an abortion with dignity and what that means. Being able to have an abortion with dignity means being recognized for the decisions that one is making, one's autonomy, but also for abortion seekers who are already parents, thinking through how all of this harm might impact their ability to continue to be parents, to do that free from the violence of abortion counseling, right, which produces, that's its own kind of violence. And the reproductive justice framework speaks about being able to parent free from violence and how those for abortion seekers who are already parents and go through this kind of violence, what does that do to them in their parenting capacity, parenting abilities? It is not a safe and supportive environment in which to be a parent. Anti-abortion counseling is not that. But then also, obviously, the right to not have children, whether that is the right to not have further children or the right to not have any children at all. That is obviously being undermined in this very violent kind of care. Okay, and then we were also then thinking about having, counseling that produces all of this harm. Another part of the violence is, what do abortion seekers do with this? What can they do with this harm? In South Africa, healthcare is very much so binaried at a gendered level, as our own chapter in this talk indicates, in terms of who is imagined as the healthcare user of abortion services. In this case, as a cisgender woman, that's who's being imagined. So binary in a very gender sense, but also binary in terms of class. So access to healthcare is very classist. Our health systems are very classist. And then also racialized in that sense. It's also a very racist healthcare system. So the majority of working class and poor, particularly folks in rural communities, Black folks who go through anti-abortion counseling, have no recourse to any kind of care that would ameliorate the harm that this counseling produces. They're left to manage that themselves because of how inequitable healthcare is in this country, in South Africa. But then also thinking of beyond cisgender women, which a lot of research and reproductive justice and particularly abortion work tends to do. There is quite a bit of work that looks at how trans and intersex folks experience some of the same harms that cisgender women do in abortion care. So even though our work only visibilize cisgender women's experiences, thinking through how some of these same harms, for example, by misgendering, we've seen in similar and different kinds of research that trans and intersex folks are violently misgendered in healthcare, in pregnancy-related healthcare. And so that in and of itself is a violence that in this very particular abortion care and directive abortion counseling would play out as well, has played out as well. Sorry. Has played out as well. So, and that's another kind of violence that would make abortion care unsafe for transgender and intersex pregnant people, abortion seekers, apart from abortion stigma itself and other kinds of anti-trans and anti-intersex violence. So then kind of conclude, we then have thought about what it would look like, what safe abortion care would look like as far as abortion counseling. And at the outset, safe abortion care, as far as counseling, would need to start off by recognizing the sex and gender diversity of people who are pregnant, people who have need of abortion services, people who want abortion, people who seek abortion services out. It would also need to recognize normative anti-abortion discourse. So providers would need to be trained to recognize those and then to eliminate them from counseling. Those should never come up in counseling. The kind of discourses about women being mothers, but even because systems of power adapt and change, even if that is suspended, we also would need to be careful to not replace that with what a good parent is supposed to be, right? A gender inclusive parent, where then it becomes, okay, not only about women and motherhood, but it becomes about parenthood and attaching parenthood to a kind of anti-abortion thing. So would be needing to be very vigilant and flexible in terms of guarding against these normative discourses, which pit parenthood against abortion, and which pit, being a good human, which pit that against abortion. which pit morality against abortion. So really excluding these harmful and normative discourses from abortion, counseling, and abortion care more broadly, recognizing the sex and gender diversity of people who have abortions, and then very importantly, listening to abortion seekers, and how they speak about their pregnancies and how they speak about the relationships they have to their pregnancies. Do they use the term fetus? Do they use the term child? Do they use various terms that have been documented in the literature? How are they speaking about their pregnancy? Is it wanted, is it unwanted? Is it both? And that providers should really follow on from the pregnant person's own relationship to their pregnancy and to their fetus or child, and or in order to effect abortion counseling that is safe for the pregnant person, whoever they may be, whatever stage they may be in their life. And then that will then ameliorate these harms and mean that abortion seekers don't have to redress these harms elsewhere or just are forced to manage it themselves. Yes, so I think that is it for me. I will leave it there. Sure, okay. So the question is, even though abortion is legal in South Africa, do professional associations of psychiatrists and psychologists and the state run mental health institutions? Do they produce information and awareness on anti-abortion counseling? Why I ask this is that in India, we saw that the mental health systems don't speak for queer rights. Even the Supreme Court here not only decriminalized, but also called on mental health professionals to also initiate social change instead of individualized, medicalized counseling with queer people. The practice of conversion therapy here was banned by the court last year, and the mental health institutions were silent about the need to do it. Okay. Do they produce information and awareness on anti-abortion counseling? I'm not sure that they do. I haven't come across any such information by the state, definitely not by the government. That is for sure. As far as I know, up until now, I have not come across any government-led initiative about anti-abortion and how to recognize it. We did, me and my colleagues did put together abortion guidelines, which we then made available to the government, and they put it into a policy. But that's been, it was, last I checked, it was significantly watered down. Yeah, it was significantly watered down. So the kind of key parts that would enable providers to recognize some of the anti-abortion discourses that we were talking about and we were explicit about pointing out, those have, if I remember, the last version I saw had been removed from that document. So yeah, and as far as psychiatrists, organizations and the like, I also haven't seen any concerted efforts from bodies of psychiatrists and psychologists that are trying to challenge this. And I think that's in part because normatively they're embedded in this, if that makes sense. Yeah, but I haven't come across, I'll leave it there. Okay, are there any other questions that folks have, or comments to any of the participants, any of the authors? Jade or Kate, if you have a question for either or a comment for either, please do. If you have one for Tracy as well on their chapter with, her chapter with Katrina and Yanela, if you have.
And there's something that's come through on the chat, Jabu.
Okay, this is for Kate. It's from Sarah Riley. Disturbed state of mind usually means you can't be trialed in a criminal court. So it's interesting that it is a specific thing for women to be trialed for. Do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, and it is sort of bizarre wording and the kind of open textured nature as well of a label like disturbed and you know, wording in like law on the books is obviously kind of leads to this sort of interesting applications of disturbed and using measurements of socially constructed ideals. So I mean, yeah, totally. That can be and I guess that's I mean quite often where the defense of infanticide is used to lessen a murder charge. That is what it's related to, the fact that there's a disturbance of mind related to reproductive function. So in that kind of context, certainly under the British Infanticide Act, people convicted of infanticide would tend to receive community sentences and not prison sentences. We actually found that in the Pacific, a lot of women did spend time in prisons, either in the lead up to trials and sometimes for quite a long period of time, but also received prison sentences. Quite a few of them were either wholly or entirely suspended, but still it just sort of shows how it's like being applied, I guess, in these contexts. So good comment, and that's probably my comment and response. Yeah, crazy.